to CNBC TV18 special debate, the budget agenda. I'm Shireen Bhan. Every year, the media is accused of making too much of the union budget. But I think this is one year where no such accusation can fly, because it's not just the media, but domestic investors and foreign investors who are watching every move of the Modi administration like a hawk. At this point in time, expectations are running very high. Hope is in the air that the Modi government will deliver on the reform agenda, that the Modi government will bring India back on an 8% plus growth trajectory. Whether the beginnings will be made in this budget, that of course is the big expectation. Arun Jaitley does have a tough balancing act ahead of him to discuss expectations, realistic and imaginative. Joining us here is a very special panel. The President of the Confederation of Indian Industry, Ajay Shriram, Subir Gokaran, the former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Sumant Sinha, a man who's betting on India's energy and infrastructure sector, R.S. Sharma, the former Chairman and Managing Director of India's largest Maharatna ONGC, and in a short while from now we'll also be joined by tax expert of BMR Advisors, Mukesh Bhutani. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Mr. Shriram, before I talk to you about budget expectations, let me congratulate CII, because all your persistence and your lobbying to actually get the Companies Act changed seem to be working, because some changes have already been announced. In fact, as we speak, a draft notification has been issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, taking into consideration some of the suggestions that CII, for instance, has made. So persistence paying off?
We really appreciate that the government consider the views of CII with a very open mind. And to be honest with you, our objective is how to make it workable, practical to assist business growth. Our basic point is, please don't treat everyone like a crook. Please don't tarnish everyone with the same brush. The reality of life is, whether it's in corporate world or in the political world or in any world, there will always be black sheep. So don't look at everyone from a point of black sheep. Please look at it from the point of view of having laws by which you can take action. But the premise we've suggested and requested is move on the basis of trust, and where the corporate entity or whoever does not adhere to that, take action.
But more than the issue of suspicion and the lack of trust, this is really about the ease of doing business, because the Minister of State for Corporate Affairs, Nirmala Sitharaman, in a conversation with us here on CNBC TV18, said that any changes to the Companies Act would be considered and would be taken forward only because the government believes that it will be easier to then transact and do business in India. So do you believe that we are likely to see all of this being cleared by Parliament now that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has put its weight behind clarifications and possible amendments?
Well, I think, as you rightly said, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman has given it serious consideration. She's had meetings with us. Last Saturday, she arranged a full-day discussion with her full secretariat, with us on the same issues. And I think what's required, you rightly said, is clarity. Let there be clear laws, let there not be ambiguity, let there not be uncertainty what can be done, what can't be done. Let's know where we stand. And I think the government has been coming out with clarification periodically, which is a very positive sign. And I hope they continue coming out with more, because still there are many areas to be addressed. We've given that document on behalf of CII to many people in the government, and we are really happy that they're looking at it positively.
Subir Gokaran, one of the other aspects that this maiden budget of Arun Jaitley is going to have to consider is the path of fiscal consolidation and ensuring that that path is a credible one and that it is followed through. What are your expectations now as far as fiscal consolidation goes? Because the room for expenditure cuts is limited. It's perhaps too narrow at this point in time, especially given the fact that growth is right up there as far as their priorities are concerned. What kind of a balancing act do you envisage Arun Jaitley to do?
Well, I rather than talk of expectations, let me talk about aspirations, because I think, this is a 1991 moment in that sense. This is the first year of a virtually guaranteed 5-year government. There are no risks to its survival at all.
And he has the political mandate
so
to
you
take
can actually
tough
afford to take a long-term strategic view of the fiscal situation and not try and achieve everything with one budget. So rather than look at this budget alone, I think we've got to look at it as a process over some time, as happened in 91, when you had 2 or 3 budgets, all of which were very significant reform agendas, or saw very significant reform agendas being implemented. I think we need to get a fix on what the fiscal situation actually is. Whatever the last government did, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether the numbers are...
What is the number that you're working with?
It doesn't matter to me maybe 4.6 is the right number, but I think we need to be absolutely clear.
Would your number be closer to 5?
No, it doesn't matter what it is. I think we need transparency.
Okay.
What the number is irrelevant. Everybody has to believe that it is the right number. That's what I think we need to do. Second is, on the expenditure side, there are two things which we need to, I think, put a lot of emphasis on. One is on the subsidy bill. There's no question that subsidies in toto have to be capped. I thought the 2012 budget did propose renewed FRBM with a cap on subsidies. I think that's a great idea. But even without the FRBM, a cap on subsidies, even if it's a voluntary cap, should be considered. And that means saying, look, we'll put a ceiling on the total, but that gives us the flexibility to adjust across commodities. Again, following up on that, the streamlining of transfers. The direct benefit transfer scheme, all kinds of controversies, all kinds of implementation issues, that doesn't mean it's a bad scheme. I think to the extent that you're able to save on costs, save on leakages by direct transfers, we have to look at that. So you're achieving the same level of welfare with lower expenditures. I think that's a goal that
So you don't necessarily see them pulling back on things like the NREGS, etc., which is what the minister has so far placed on record, that we're not going to move away from spending the amount that the UPA was, but we will look at better targeting and more efficient utilization.
Even if they achieve more effective targeting with a plan, with a strategy. It's not going to happen in one budget, but a strategy has to be put in place.
Like the experiment with diesel, marginal monthly hikes, the government is perhaps going to bite the bullet and hike LPG and kerosene prices perhaps monthly in small doses. Do you think that the time has come now for this government to move forward? They have the political mandate. They don't have to be worried about numbers in parliament. Do you believe that this is something that we are going to see happen, perhaps even before the budget?
Yes, of course. I feel this should have been started much earlier. You know, look at the diesel price increase. When ad hoc increases used to happen, 1 rupee, 2 rupee, there used to be a huge, strong reaction to that. And now, ever since they started this 50 paisa per month increase, it has been absorbed in the system and nobody hardly takes a notice. And fortunately, the under-recoveries came down less than 2 rupees per litre. But unfortunately, now again, the crude prices are moving up. So that gap is again widening. But sooner the better. They should start the same way for LPG, kerosene in small doses, but they should do it every month.
Sumant Sinha, over to you now. Infrastructure and energy, both these sectors are high on the priority list of the Modi administration. Clearly, expectations are running high. Do you believe that this is going to be a case of expecting too much and perhaps not being able to see them deliver as much as the hopes have been built up?
Given the mandate that Mr. Modi has, I think it's but natural to have, sky-high expectations, and especially given the hole that we've sunk ourselves into. I think as far as energy and infrastructure is concerned, certainly those have to be critical areas of this government's focus, and they have, in fact...
24/7 electricity is a promise that the Power Minister Piyush Goyal is making. He's met with bankers, he's met with the Power Producers Association. Do you really see 24/7 electricity being a reality anytime soon? And I'm not talking about the next 12 to 24 months even.
No, I agree with you. I think it's going to take time, but it could happen in a 5 to 10 year time frame is my expectation. But certainly, I think before that, the kind of deficits that we have, particularly in the peak months, those are things that can certainly be addressed. I think the issues really are, and these are really in some senses go beyond the budget, really the other process issues, things like land acquisition issues, the ease of getting approvals and doing business. I think those are things that perhaps can't really be addressed in the budget, but are absolutely critical in creating the right
I'm going to interrupt you because on the issue of the land acquisition, and this has been something that industry once again has been lobbying with the government, and we do have the minister on record to CNBC TV 18 saying that while they will not touch the compensation clause, the acquisition clauses will perhaps be tweaked because it's too complicated to go through with. Do you anticipate changes in the Land Acquisition Act as early as the budget session?
I would hope so. And I think what she's touched upon really is the key issue, which is the fact that the whole timeline is just too long. And if it takes 4 or 5 years to acquire land for any project, then clearly no project is going to get off the ground. So if she can actually, or if the government can actually tweak that process and make it a lot shorter and make it much more visible in terms of the total expanse of time required, I think that will be a significant win. Now, whether it happens in the budget session or subsequently, I do hope it is one of the first things that the government does do.
Mukesh Bhutani, let me bring you in on this conversation, because the hope at this point is that this government will actually do whatever it takes to woo investors, domestic and foreign. As far as FDI is concerned, we understand that whether it's railways, it's construction, we could perhaps see the government moving, and even defense moving fairly quickly. The UNCTAD has put out a report where India has actually slipped a notch on the FDI ranking to number 4. Crucial to attracting investment is going to be how this government deals with the retrospective tax law. Do you believe that we are going to see clarification, amendments in the budget?
I hope the government repeals the retrospective law, but it's speculation at this point in time whether they will do it or not. I think the question before the government would be, are they going to sacrifice the medium to long term for the sake of short term? A law which has been validly passed by the parliament, it is a real challenge. So somebody has to really walk the talk and say, I'm going to make this environment more business friendly and really repeal the law. I think if the government does that, that's the right thing to do, because in the short term they may have to forego.
Place your bets. Do you see them moving as far as repealing, or do you see them making clarifications?
I would put 60-40 in favor of repealing the law, because I think the government knows very well the kind of impact this has caused and the hemorrhage in the FDI figures that we have seen in the last 2 to 3 years. Because you see, if you look at it from a business standpoint, not just from a foreign investor standpoint, nobody wants to get into the technical nuances of, what did the Supreme Court say in Vodafone or any other case. But they are looking at certainty and stability of the law.
Yeah.
So the actions of the government in the last 3 to 4 years doesn't suggest that they want certainty and stability. And that's the larger message that they have to communicate by repealing the law.
The fear is that what a rating agency is going to say if he doesn't stick to the fiscal deficit number that was laid out in the previous budget. Will they be satisfied if, as Mukesh Bhutani and you pointed out earlier, he lays out a very clear roadmap of what this government intends to do to perhaps get to a 5% national fiscal deficit over the next 3 years?
I think so. I think the credibility of a fiscal commitment now is very high, because there is no political threat. There is no factor visible that, except for external developments, a shock, energy shock or something like that, which will sort of likely derail these commitments. So this is the space that this government has, which it has to use as effectively as possible. It has the space to make long-term commitments. It has the space to introduce changes over a sequence, rather than trying to address every problem at once because the situation is so desperate.
Sumant, this government is talking about an integrated energy policy. The previous government also spoke about an integrated energy policy. Let's see how far we get this time around. But things like opening up the coal sector and coal sector reforms, big on the agenda. We've heard the minister, we've heard the prime minister talk about it. Do you finally see the monopoly of coal in India being broken? Do you perhaps expect this government to make any announcement about that in the budget?
I think what is very critical in this budget is not just the actual numbers for this particular year, but also the long-term roadmap that the FM lays out, and whether in fact it does lay out a long-term roadmap. The issue is going to be really about what is the commitment for the future. And I think if the commitment for the future is strong and it is backed by the political mandate, then in fact, even if this year's numbers look a little bit not so good, the fiscal deficit, I think people are going to give it a go by. I think as far as the energy side is concerned, it's great, first of all, that we have one single minister across coal, power and renewable energy, because there are lots of issues between all the 3 ministries and areas that are common. For example, grid issues, grid integration issues, the issues around the financial health of the distribution companies, the fact that most distribution actually is in the hands of state governments and in fact should be privatized over time. So when you look at the power sector as a whole, almost 70 to 80% of it is still in the hands of different parts of the government. And so there's a lot of things that can be done.
Mukesh Patani, I want to come back to you and talk taxes. The previous finance minister was known for introducing new taxes in his budget. The fringe benefit tax was just one of them. The super rich tax was another. Do you see any new taxes being introduced by Finance Minister Arun Jaitley? And my second question to you, the health minister has made a proposal to hike cigarette taxes quite significantly. We see this happen, every budget. But do you think that sin tax, perhaps more duties on cigarettes, on alcohol, perhaps could be a source of revenue for this government?
Divide this debate in two categories. One is the direct tax and second is indirect tax. I don't see any additional dosage of direct tax. As a matter of fact, I anticipate he will clarify the issue on inheritance tax. And I'm basketing inheritance tax as a part of direct tax. As far as sin tax is concerned, I think every economy in the world levies it, depending on what's the focus of the government is. Yeah. Exactly. So I don't consider those forms of taxes as necessarily putting a burden. I think those are more like anti-trade taxes that you put to discourage people from using those products.
And taxes that nobody can argue with you over.
Then there are other forms of taxes which come by way of surcharges and cesses which come in difficult situations. And he is faced with a difficult situation on crude oil.
Do you expect a surcharge or a cess of some sort?
It would be unpopular, but if he does that, it shouldn't shock an economist.
Do you believe that he has any room at this point in time to please the Aam Aadmi? Do you believe that the exemption limit, which is what is being talked about at this point in time, could perhaps go up to 3 lakhs? Perhaps not to 5, which is the expectation, but a more staggered approach?
Absolutely. You need to bear in mind that if you look at the component of tax revenues by the government, and even if you look at the breakup between the direct tax collection, what tax contribution the common man makes, and I'm looking at the common man where the tax rate is between 10, 15, 20%, is a very insignificant part. So I certainly don't rule out the possibility of he rejigging the slabs to give the benefit to a common man, perhaps increasing the limit on savings. But I think what the industry is expecting, and there's a very wide speculation, is that insofar as SEZs is concerned,
the MAT will be done away with.
MAT and possibly the dividend distribution tax, because if you go back into the history of the SEZ law, this was a commitment that was there in the 2005 law. So I think that is expected. Now, with all of these giveaways, it is going to be a very difficult task for him now to take away the surcharges.
We are given to understand that this government would like to enhance retail participation, and this is perhaps going to be a capital market-driven recovery that we see this time around. R.S. Sharma, I want you to comment on this business of disinvestment. As a former chairman of ONGC, do you think that the government should get more aggressive as far as disinvestment is concerned?
Disinvestment does not mean that divestment. It's only dilution, a more float to come into the market. And that's a very valid issue. Every time in the past, I have seen it happening. They announce a dilution, they announce an FPO. The stage comes, the price fixation, the government develops cold feet. That's the problem. ONGC, when it was wholly government-owned, and when it became, after, public accountability, the whole governance process in the company improved dramatically. So that should happen for all the companies.
Wrap-up comments, 10 seconds to each of our panelists. Ajay Sriram, the 3 things that you believe we will see in this budget.
I think, one, the government will give further indications of good governance. I think that's the most important. Second, I would say, is infrastructure focus should be very sharp, because unless the infrastructure base develops, economic activity will not go. And third, I think focus on agriculture.
I think we'll see some move on subsidies, some attempt to, put sort of limit on them. I think we'll see some significant action on capital spending, infrastructure. Again, not necessarily allocations in this budget, but a plan. And I think we'll see, as we did in 1991, because I think the comparison is very, very significant, the similarities. The budget being placed in a larger strategic context with an attempt to articulate, the grand reform plan rather than just looking at the fiscal numbers.
Sumant Sinha, your top three.
I think that on the macro numbers, I think particularly the fiscal deficit, I don't think the government is going to go the whole hog and just sort of clamp down on the fiscal deficit. I think for all the reasons mentioned earlier, I think there is going to be prudency around trying to cut, but not really by a huge amount. But within that, change the quality of the fiscal deficit itself. So I think that's certainly something that is going to happen. I think in addition to that, they'll probably choose perhaps 5 or 6 different sectors. I hope renewable energy is one of them, but certainly could be any of those 4 or 5 other sectors. And they'll probably try to use those as sort of stimulus areas, because somewhere, somehow, we have to sort of push this economy forward.
Mr. Sharma, your top three.
At a macro level, address the investor sentiment, which has dramatically gone down in the last 4 or 5 years. Second, create a much wider awareness campaign on the pricing issues.
Right.
Thing is, now the crude oil, all the producers get international prices. Why for gas only that the producer will not get the international parity price?
Okay.
Thirdly, specifically for this oil and gas industry, we have to launch that next round, give a clear message about the fiscal stability, that whatever has been announced has to be honored by the sovereign government.
Absolutely, before we actually launch the next NELP round. Mukesh Bhutani, I'm going to close with you. Your top three.
See, I think one thing I like about this government is that they don't talk about 1 year or 5 years. They started talking about 10 years. So budget, I don't think for this government will be an annual statement. I anticipate, number one, timelines for tax reforms, both GST and DTC. 2, I think there'll be greater level of focus on tax reforms, not from a legislative side, but from an administrative side. And 3, I guess I can't find any third because everyone covered it. I think possibly a roadmap on reforms.
Okay.
But if I have to add a 4th one, a boost to manufacturing.
Okay. A boost to manufacturing. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have to close this pre-budget discussion on what the expectation is from the Modi government from this maiden budget that Arun Jaitley is going to present on the 10th of July. As we pointed out at the start of the show, expectations are running high. It is likely to be an aspirational budget, or that is at least what the panel is hoping for. Let's see how much of this will translate into reality. All of us here on the show, goodbye. Many thanks for watching.